So, since a number of you have voted for me to continue on with Spengler Volume 2, I'm going to go ahead and walk us through that then, chapter by chapter, which I'm happy to do. But before doing that, what I would like to do is review an essay that Spengler wrote in between these two volumes called Prussianism and Socialism. And it's an essay that's worth going over because it fleshes out what I suggested that the world wars were about, was this conflict between culture and civilization, as Spengler defines those two terms, which it really was, but Spengler's essay on Prussianism and Socialism bears this out in a much more detailed, refined, and nuanced way. And it was an essay, it's a very long essay, kind of a short book, that came out in 1920. Volume 1 comes out in 1918, Volume 2 in 1922. So it's right in between them. And what it does is it's an attempt to apply his culture-morphological differences that he had used to describe the essential differences of each of the high civilizations from each other, only now he uses it to apply it to the differences between the nation states within Western Europe itself, Western Faustian Europe. So it's very fascinating. It serves as a wonderful appendix, I think, to the first volume, and serves as a very fascinating analysis of some of the basic physiognomic traits and differences that each of the nation states have. And also, in a certain sense, it's amusing because he disparages the French and disparages the British, but it's also not so amusing because you can see that it's the kind of thinking that led us into the catastrophe of the world wars, the sort of finger-pointing and name-calling and projection of inferiority complexes onto the other guy's side that did indeed lead to that war, which more or less was a European family feud. But it's interesting to look at it as it's characterized from the German point of view. Some of it's valid, some of it's perhaps caricatured and exaggerated, but I find it fascinating and worth discussing. So what Spengler does in this essay is that he says that all the great civilizations, though they are fundamental unities, are nonetheless characterized normally by a fundamental schism, a tension within that soul, within the soul of the respective civilization. And from out of that tension, the various disputes of its separate nations, whether it's city-states in Greece or nation-states in Europe, arises. And in the case of, for example, the classical civilization, he says the tension was an Apollonian and Dionysian tension, exactly as Nietzsche said that it was, but that bore itself out, rather, in political tendencies between, for example, Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian Wars, the Spartans carrying on the Apollonian side, the Athenians, the Dionysian side, insofar as we have this, and then later this pours itself out in the tension between the Roman Senate and Julius Caesar, bringing the plebeian tendency. So we have the conservative Senate and the plebeian tendency embodied by Caesar. And so this basic tension plays itself out throughout that civilization. He says that in China, the basic tension there was that between the Confucians and the Taoists, Lao Tzu, whether to uphold the rules and laws and conventions of Li, Li, the grand laws of the universe, and have respect for them, or to depart from that in favor of Tao and follow the way of nature and leave civilization to itself, turn your back on it and go out into the woods and follow the Tao. We might say the Aslan approach in our civilization. So he's going to say in Western civilization, this basic tension has been a tension between what he calls socialism versus anarchism. And by socialism, he actually means it in a very, very broad sense in which it's not normally used. In his case, he means it as the tendency toward universal domination by one group to try to create a universal imperium or a universal ideal and to impose it upon the rest of Europe. And he says the anarchist tendency, though, first came about during the Renaissance. He also says this: the opposition is there first in the Gothic versus the Renaissance. And the Renaissance opposes this with the Gothic universalism with this anarchistic tendency. He says that if we look at Renaissance Florence, 15th century Florence is where anarchism began, where we have this very short-sighted political mentality, a very politically opportunist mentality of sort of every state for itself, Florence versus Milan versus Rome, all these states fighting each other, this sort of myriad of robber principalities, condottieri, and this world of politically opportunist Machiavellian politics of these individual city-states fighting against each other for very short-sighted aims and interests, for very small reasons. And there is no universalizing tendency there in Italy. But he says that the universalizing tendency started actually with the Spaniards. Spain carries on the Gothic tradition and has this grand universalizing tendency to create. There's a tendency amongst the Spaniards to create an imperialistic, a kind of imperialistic mentality and to impose it on the rest of Europe. This is what led them to their discoveries of America, and eventually they conquered the Italians. And when, with the sack of Rome in 1527, they came in and conquered the Italians. It is really to the Spaniards that we owe the ultramontane tendencies of the Vatican, which begin at this point. The ultramontanism is the imposition of the Vatican's universalist agenda against all the local dioceses and so forth. He says that tendency came from the Spaniards. They introduced it into Italy, so that much of what we think of as the universal tendencies of the Vatican actually came from Madrid, from the Spaniards. Then he says that long about the middle of the 17th century, in 1659, with the Treaty of the Pyrenees, when the Spaniards have to cede to the French, and then the French take over. They became the main power in the latter half of the 17th century. The French revert back, he says, to the anarchism of the Italians. Basically, the spirit of the Medici replays itself in the salons of Paris, in the short-sighted political conquests of Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi, as he says. And the conquests there are very small. They're mostly boundary disputes. There is no imposition of a universal ideal on the rest of Europe in 17th century France. And then he says that the French Rococo, the creation of the 18th century French Rococo creation, is really a melange, a creation of tendencies taken from the Italian Renaissance and the Spanish Baroque and late Gothic, and all applied together to create this Rococo, this grand culture style that is created by the French in the 18th century. Which is interesting because he says the French started out by not having any culture. Francis I going into Italy in 1516 because they didn't have a Renaissance there, and they had to actually physically go down into Italy, pack it up and import it, carry it off back to Paris by force. They brought Leonardo, they actually took Leonardo with them back to Paris. And so they create out of all this grand European culture ideal, whereas Spengler says that in the North, in the case of the Prussians versus the British, and the majority of this essay is based on the tension between these two Germanic peoples, the British on the one hand and the Germans on the other, which he calls the Prussians, is that the English all along have not had culture. They have represented the civilization idea all along. There's never been a culture in England at all, in contrast to the French and the Prussians. And then he's going to say that, so in the North, then, with the creation in the 17th century of parliamentary politics, in the English Revolution, we have the creation of the English sense of statehood there in the middle of the 17th century. And at the same time in the 18th century, starting with Frederick William I, and then Frederick the Great, we have the creation of Prussianism, the creation of a unified Prussian state. And he says what happens there in the North is that both peoples are descendants of Vikings. They're both descendants of ancient Germans. But in the one case, in the case of England, the Viking tendency predominated and remained down to the present day, down to the time that he's writing in, as its primary ideal in England. The Viking conqueror who is out for himself and sees the rest of the world as booty, as spoil, to be conquered. This piratical mentality, this every man for himself mentality remained the British economic ideal, so that, largely due to the fact that England is insular and isolated, it could afford to do away with the state for the most part. There really is, Spengler says, no sense of the state in England. It's every man for himself, politically speaking. Money is the ruling and the highest ideal. It has been in England all along. And the businessman is the primary English exemplar, the primary sense of what it is to be an Englishman. It's to be wealthy, to have money. And their entire sense of social hierarchy is derived from how much money you have. He says the Prussians are not like that. And the Prussian sense of socialism is based on this. It's descended from the Teutonic Knights rather than the Vikings, with their creation in Eastern Europe of a series of small principalities, which then become the basis for the Prussian state. And it's the state that counts for the Prussians. The individual is subordinate to the state. And so we get these Prussian military ideals. To the businessman, Spengler opposes the Prussian military man, the civil servant. He says that the businessman's suit is, for the English, how one appears in society. For the Prussians, it's the military uniform. This is how the aristocracy presents itself in society, always in a kind of military uniform. And the sense of social rank, it is a very socially conscious, hierarchical society like the British, but it isn't based on wealth. It's based on rank. It's based on ability and where you're at in the social rank of the society. He says the negative side of this is that it leads to a lot of title seeking. There's a German obsession with titles, Herr, Doktor, and so forth, that characterizes the society. But the ideal of the society is to subordinate the individual to the servitude of the state, and that wealth is something, as it was conceived of in the middle of the 18th century by Frederick William I, as something for the whole. That we are all working in Prussian society so that everyone can become wealthy, so that the whole state can exist as a wealthy entity doing well unto itself. Whereas for the British, it really is every man for himself. It's the idea of the creation of the American billionaire, and really everything that he says that's characteristic of England is also characteristic of America to this day, in which the state is a negligible factor, and the ideal in American politics is to keep the state out of business affairs as much as possible, to get away, to leave regulation out of account, so that money can flow and billionaires can rise at the expense of the rest of society. And that is that American ideal, which is current, I think, to this day, comes out of this British piratical Viking mentality idea that the world is spoils, booty, for whoever can get there first. And then so we have the civil servant as the primary idea in Prussian society, the grand man whose main idea is work is something that is not done as a means toward the end of wealth. For the British man, work is the means toward the end of acquiring wealth so that one won't have to work. Work is then regarded as an evil, according to Spengler, in British society. But this is not the case in Prussian society. Work is a duty, and it's regarded as a divinely appointed duty, and it's not seen as a means toward an end, but as an end in and of itself. The individual works, that's his duty. And duty is put ahead of individual interests in Prussian society, and he says basically this is what makes Prussian society great. Its sense of grandeur of state organization. Everything is very organized in the German state. It's a very organized civil machine that runs very efficiently because it has a sense for the regard of the totality. The state is the primary thing for the Germans. For the British, it's the individual, the rich, wealthy businessman. And the state there is a negligible entity. So that's how he characterizes the differences between the nation states, and you can already see the next World War coming here. It's very clear that it's going to come out of this kind of mentality. But then he moves on in the essay toward a critique of Marx, which I don't want to get into here, but he concludes the essay after the critique of Marx with a description of the Russians. And this is for the first time he begins to move into his idea of the Russians as representing not just another nation state in Europe amongst these other nation states, but as culturally other. The Russians are a different civilization entirely. He says all these political differences and economic differences between the nation states in Europe all at once fall into basically a unity. You can see it as a single civilization by contrast with the Russians, where the Russian civilization is the only one of Spengler's civilizations, it's the ninth of them, that is now in process of awakening. It's coming into being. It's entering into its early springtime phase. It's undergoing a pseudomorphosis, a Western European pseudomorphosis, with Peter the Great's importation into Russia of Western European culture forms, architecture, the sense of politics, eventually industrialization, and so forth. All of that is carried over to Russia as a pseudomorphosis. It doesn't belong there. The Russians are uncomfortable with it. And he says that the Russians are in a deeply pious, fundamentally religious phase where the countryside and the peasant are the high ideals. Even the peasant, when he moves into the city, when he moves into Moscow or Petersburg, carries the mental image of the village along with him into the cities. the obsession with dirt and poverty and the mysticism in Dostoevsky. He says Dostoevsky really is a kind of Dante figure in this civilization. He had intended at one point to write a novel about the life of Christ, and Spengler says that if he had done so, it would have functioned as an authentic gospel within this civilization, since the Gospels are the epos that come at the beginning of Magian civilization that correspond to the Homeric epos and the Arthurian romances. He says Dostoevsky is the figure, less so Tolstoy, because Tolstoy is more the man of the intellect, more the man of the city, and is closer to the Western European pseudomorphoses than